Hanyu, visiting Mount Heng, I stayed overnight at Jue Temple and inscribed this on the gate archway. The 5 sacred mountains are as honored as the 3 dukes. Song Mountain holds the center, guarded by the other 4. Here in this fiery southern place, wild enough for ghosts and demons, local spirits carry heaven-granted special powers. Swirling clouds and clinging mists half conceal the torso. There has to be a summit, but who had ever seen it? I arrived right in the autumn rainy season, gloomy weather, overcast with no fresh winds. My silent praying seemed to find an answer. Wasn't this divine response to honesty and virtue? Suddenly the clouds around the peak were swept away. Looking up, I saw the column, buttressing the blue void. The purple canopy was linked to the celestial pillar. The stone granary leaped toward the god of fire. Deep in awe, I dismounted, offered up a prayer, then rushed past pine and cypress to the temple. Wall after wall, crimson columns shining, images of spirits, demons, garish red and blue. I climbed the steps, offered up dried meat and wine, hoping my sincerity excused such meager gifts. The old priest of the temple was acquainted with the spirits. With a piercing stare, he sized me up, and bowing low, took a bowl of divination discs, showed me how to cast them, assured me that their pattern was by far the most auspicious. Although I'm exiled in barbarian lands, my fortune hasn't faded. I've simple food and clothes enough to meet my needs. My hopes for worldly fame have long been set aside. Now I value hard-won blessings from the gods. That night I lay in the temple's high pavilion. The light of stars and moon was dimmed by dawn's light clouds. Apes called. A bell sounded, reminding me that it was day. Then, over in the east, a cold, bright sun appeared. So we've had occasion to speak before of the 5 great mountains in China. In traditional Chinese mythology, 5 mountains were given pride of place over all of the other mountains of the realm, all of which were in their own way sacred and deserving of worship and of veneration. But these 5 were the axis mundi, the parts of the gigantic body of the first giant, Pangu, after he had collapsed. And they were also a form of, we could say, geologic mandala. That is, you had mountains in each of the great directions, north, south, east, west, and center. And they were a summary of all the powers and forces and gods of the world. In very remote China, the spirits of the directions were worshipped. They were the Di. So the yellow Di was the god of the center. The blue Di was the god of the east, and different states worshipped them in different ways. So out of the 5 great mountains, Mount Heng, this is the mount in the south. So it was well beyond the pale of what had been traditional China under the Zhou dynasty, but it was part of the empire in later periods, like the Han and especially the Tang, which is the one that occupies us here. But it would have been in the remote south of the empire. And out of these 5 mountains, generally the most important one, or at least the one that got the most attention, probably because it was also closer to the centers of imperial government, was Mount Tai. And we've had a poem already that we read some weeks or months ago by Du Fu on gazing at Mount Tai, if you will remember. So this is the second poem, as far as I'm aware of, in this anthology, about one of the 5 sacred mountains. What is the topic of this poem? Well, it connects very well with Mountain Rocks by Han Yu. In its style and in its topic, only there we had an anonymous mountain and temple, and here we have a famous mountain and temple. So the main topic is landscape seeing, climbing a mountain. But we must remember that landscape poetry, especially climbing mountain poetry, is never just about climbing a mountain and enjoying nature. Remember, mountains always have overtones in Chinese beliefs, in Chinese society and culture. They are places of enlightenment, places of elevation, places of insight and farsight. So one gets special knowledge and far-sighted knowledge and expands the view with the eyes of the soul while climbing one of these mountains. A minor topic, especially at the end of the poem, that adds up to this one is contentment with one's lot in life. The renunciation of high and lofty ambitions for success and material power. Okay, so let's take a look at the poem bit by bit. Its style is very similar to the ones we've already read by Han Yu. It's pretty transparent. It could almost be an oration or a diary. It describes Han Yu's visit to Mount Heng and his stay at the Jue Temple. The poem has a series of stanzas, each of which corresponds roughly to a topic it develops. So the first stanza presents the famous southern Mount Heng. The second stanza, describes how the poetic persona is able to see the peak through an almost miraculous intervention of the gods responding to his prayer. The third stanza describes as the temple. In the fourth, we get a little reflection of Han Yu saying, I'm no longer worried about worldly success. Living is enough for me. And finally, in the conclusion, we get the night spent at the temple and the early morning. So let's take a look at the poem piece by piece. The 5 sacred mountains are as honored as the 3 dukes. Song Mountain holds the center, guarded by the other 4. So the first couplet introduces, even though every Chinese would have known what the 5 mountains were, the first couplet begins with a description and explanation of the importance of these mountains. It says, these 5 mountains are as honored as the 3 dukes. 3 dukes here stands, this is generally translated more commonly as the 3 excellencies. Sangong is the 3 top bureaucratic positions of the empire, the 3 heads of the great bureaucratic departments that ruled Tang China, the Department of State Affairs, the Chancellery, and the Secretariat. So these mountains are as honored as the highest people in the civil service, just below the emperor. And Song Mountain is the one in the middle. That doesn't mean it's especially privileged. I'm not aware of it being a privileged space for sacrifice worship or for poetry. But anyway, it's in the center and the others surround it. Here, in this fiery southern place, wild enough for ghosts and demons, local spirits carry heaven-granted special powers. This is the mountain in the south, and therefore it is associated with the elements that are associated with the south, with the color red, summer, the basic element of fire, certain types of animals, and other aspects. So this is the southern mountain, and it's surrounded by powerful spirits that protect it and that get special powers because they're in such a sacred space. Swirling clouds and clinging mists half conceal the torso. There has to be a summit, but who had ever seen it? So now the last couplet of the first stanza shows us the mountain, but it's a hidden picture of the mountain. The mountain is anthropomorphized. It seems to have a torso, which refers to probably the main body of the mountain, but it's hidden by mists and clouds, so that its summit is not seen, and rhetorically the poetic persona asks if anybody has ever seen it. It must be pretty common to see Heng Shan surrounded by mists and clouds. Of course, this rhetorical question about seeing the summit connects us with the next stanza, where a miracle seems to occur so that the summit becomes visible to Han Yu's gaze. I arrived right in the autumn rainy season. gloomy weather, overcast with no fresh winds. We have the location, now we have the season, it's autumn, and it's a dark, gloomy autumn. Not Autumn is always a melancholy season for the Chinese, but here we only seem to be getting the darker aspects of the season. My silent praying seemed to find an answer. Wasn't this divine response to honesty and virtue? So Hanyu is praying. He prays perhaps to the gods to allow him to see the mountain in its glorious splendor, especially the peak. And the prayer seems to find an answer. And Hanyu, in a particularly immodest stance, seems to be supposing that his virtue, his honesty, are the ones that lead the gods to answer to his prayer. I don't know up to what point this is rhetoric, this is just rhetoric, or it's genuinely felt by Hanyu. I am aware that there was a poem by Sushi, the greatest poet of the next dynasty, the Song dynasty, and probably the second or third best ever Chinese poem, in which he pokes fun at Hanyu for this precise line, saying, okay, the gods were probably not answering you, Hanyu. But anyway, in the fiction of this poem, the gods answer the virtuous prayer of a virtuous man, at least in this small aspect. And what happens? Well, suddenly the clouds around the peak were swept away. Looking up, I saw the column buttressing the blue void. So suddenly the clouds part, heaven opens a little bit, and the poet is able to see the summit of Mount Heng, which feels like a peak, like a column against the blue void of the heavenly vault. Now the next couplets seem to be comparing some names of peaks or sections of the mountains with names of constellations, and continue this line of the mountain, Mount Heng, reaching up to the heavens. The purple canopy was linked to the celestial pillar. The stone granary leaped toward the god of fire. Deep in awe I dismounted, offered up a prayer, then rushed past pine and cypress to the temple. So we might imagine that Hanyu is at the foot of the mountain, not at the top. He was on horseback, and after getting this satisfaction of seeing the summit of Mount Heng, he offers a prayer, dismounts, and goes to the temple at the foot of Mount Heng. This temple still exists today. I believe it was built in the 8th century during the Tang era, so relatively shortly before Hanyu's visit. The next stanza describes the temple. Wall after wall, crimson columns shining. Images of spirits, demons, garish red and blue. We had spirits, supernatural spirits evoked in the first stanza, the local spirits with heaven granted special powers. Now we have those same spirits and others painted on the walls of the temple. So there's an echo of the spirits there and here. In bright colors, this couplet is very colorful. We have garish reds and blues for painting these creatures, and then we have the crimson columns of the temple. We might imagine that this would have been a wooden construction. It was just like the Buddhist temples that were almost contemporary and that subsist in Japan. Very typical for imperial buildings in some of these temples to be painted in red, in lacquered red, imitating cinnabar. So those would be the shining crimson columns of the walls. I climbed the steps, offered up dried meat and wine, hoping my sincerity excused such meager gifts. Hanyu is not rich. He is in exile, as we've learned from the previous poem. And this poem is probably from that time, from the same time when he was exiled in the south. So he only is able to afford, a small offering, a small sacrifice to the gods. But it's sincere, it's deeply felt. The old priest of the temple was acquainted with the spirits. With a piercing stare, he sized me up, and bowing low, took a bowl of divination discs, showed me how to cast them, assured me that their pattern was by far the most auspicious. So while in the temple, what happens? A priest appears, he judges Hanyu, he sizes him up, and he informs him of a method of divination. Divination was very popular in traditional China. In fact, one of the sacred Confucian books, the I Ching, is a book of divination. And so here there are some divination discs. I'm not sure what they are, but probably pieces of metal that could be used for trying to guess the future. And the pattern is very auspicious. So good for Hanyu. So the next stanza, we will see the result of the divination, and also we will see the contentness with his current state of Hanyu. He's not ambitious. His divination is not for high desires of getting back to court and service. At least that's what he pretends in the voice of this poem, whether it be the truth or not. So although I'm exiled in barbarian lands, my fortune hasn't faded. I've simple food and clothes enough to meet my needs. So very humbly, this scholar official in exile in a barbarian land considers himself lucky because he's got simple food and enough clothes to protect himself. And one shouldn't wish for more. That's enough for being happy, for considering one lucky. And, Hanyu might be being hypocritical or displaying a rhetorical trope here, but there is a deep truth in this. I mean, Hanyu was a member of a privileged elite in a time when most of his fellow citizens of the empire would have been peasants, eking out a hard, tough existence in hopes, as Hobbes would say, nasty, brutish, and short. Only being alive and in good health today, in a time when we live in much opulence, but when we're experiencing a horrible plague like the coronavirus, just living is something to be happy and celebratory about. Yeah? Life is a miracle into itself, and we only appreciate things when we lose them. So there is a deep truth in this couplet of Hanyu's. And he says, my hopes, it goes on, my hopes for worldly fame have long been set aside. Now I value hard-won blessings from the gods. So the poem concludes. The last stanza, so this stanza was philosophical. The last stanza gets us back to the physical scenery of the temple and to the night he passed there in the morning. That night I lay in the temple's high pavilion. The light of stars and moon was dimmed by dawn's light clouds. We might imagine this area in the south, next to Hengshan, is a wet and a misty area, perpetually covered by fog and mist. So the poet couldn't enjoy the light of the moon and the stars at night. The mists were hiding them, but especially the dawn's clouds. So we're near the dawn. Either the poet has woken up early or he has stayed all night awake. This is the sight, or the relative lack of sight. The sounds come in the next stanza, and also the conclusion with the sun coming out, a new day, a new time dawning on the temple and perhaps on Hanyu's own life. Apes called, a bell sounded, reminding me that it was day. Then, over in the east, a cold, bright sun appeared. The sun is still cold because it's very early, so the coolness of autumn night still impregnates everything in the hall. And the sounds, the apes are the sounds of nature, the bells are the sounds of the Buddhist temple, measuring the hours in a time when clocks were not ubiquitous and present. And the poem ends with the morning, and presumably we might imagine with Hanyu's departure from this short trip, from this short stay at this temple and mountain. And with the sun rising, we will finish this poem ourselves.